Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Understanding the Impact of Climate Change on Abandoned Mine Sites in Canada. My name is John Somerville and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm a policy analyst in Natural Resources Canada's Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division. If you run into any audio or technical issues during the webinar, please hover your mouse over Suzanne's name in the attendee list under Host and click on Start Private Chat. Please note that your lines have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of each presentation, but don't wait till the end to pose your questions. You can fill those in the chat bar to the left of your screen, and those will be answered by the presenters at the end of their presentations. We are recording the webinar today, and we'll be sending out a link to everyone who has registered. So today's webinar is brought to you by Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform through the Mining Working Group. The working group consists of representatives from federal, provincial, territorial, industry, academia, as well as non-governmental and other organizations. The working group is chaired by Natural Resources Canada. The first presentation today was funded through a call for proposals in August of 2017 through NRCan's Climate Change Adaptation Program under risk assessments on existing orphan and abandoned mine sites. So now I'd like to introduce the speakers for our first presentation. This will be lessons learned from assessing climate change risks at an abandoned mine site, Kamkosha. Jackie Richard is a project manager at the Climate Risk Institute. She's worked in the fields of environmental monitoring and assessment, project management, and climate change impacts and adaptation for the past 20 years. Over the last 14 years, Jackie has focused on work on climate change impacts and adaptation and has worked on a wide variety of projects to help decision makers and stakeholders adapt to the impacts of climate change. Glenn Milner is an engineer and climate risk lead at the Climate Risk Institute. Over the past 10 years, he has worked on climate risk and adaptation initiatives across Ontario, Canada, and the United States. His work extends across infrastructure, ecosystems, stormwater, agricultural, transportation, and supporting government and adaptation policies. A professional engineer specializing in water resources, Glenn holds a master's degree in climate change and has a passion for translating complex data to enable resilient decision-making. So I will turn things over to Jackie for our first presentation, and over to you.
Thanks, John, and hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I guess I'm in control of the controls right now. So as John mentioned, Glenn and I are with the Climate Risk Institute, and we are a not-for-profit organization that provides domestic and international stakeholders and decision makers with climate services they require to build resilience and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And some of you may have known us in our previous life as OCARE, the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources. So this is just an overview of our presentation today. We have a couple of slides on the need for this work and objectives of the project, and then I will pass the reins over to Glenn, who will talk about the climate change risk assessment undertaken at the Kamkosha, or for the Kamkosha abandoned mine site. So why do we need to do this work? Well, this is a great diagram that describes climate change basics, really. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, but we can fix it. As most of you probably know, right now the annual global average temperature is about 1 degree Celsius hotter than pre-industrial levels. And the world's scientists have confirmed in the 2008 IPCC report that at the current rate, the world could cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius hotter as soon as the 2030s. And that's only a decade from now, well within the lifespan of many people. We know that human beings are causing climate change largely by the burning of fossil fuels, and an overwhelming 97% of scientists agree climate change is being caused by human greenhouse gas emissions. 1 degree Celsius of warming has already resulted in devastating impacts across the planet, from heat waves to floods, stronger storms, sea level rise. We also know that global warming amplifies the intensity, duration, and frequency of heat waves, drought, and wildfires, for example. In fact, an extremely dry winter coupled with unseasonably hot weather fueled the devastating wildfires that went across North America in 2016, and that includes the disastrous fire in Fort McMurray. But the good news is we can fix it. Reducing our reliance on fossil fuels by transitioning to renewable resources will certainly help that. But we also need to adapt, and that's the focus of our presentation today. So what about Canada? Well, Canada's Changing Climate Report, pictured here on the slide, released last year, assessed the current knowledge about how Canada's climate is changing, and provided here are a series of headline statements that tell a concise story about how Canada's climate is changing. It has warmed and will warm further, driven by human influence. Precipitation is projected to increase for most of Canada on average, although summer rainfall may decrease in some areas. The seasonal availability of fresh water is changing, with an increased risk of water supply shortages in the summer. And a warmer climate will intensify some extreme weather events into the future. And implications for the mining industry, including abandoned and orphan mine sites. Well, warmer temperatures and thawing of permafrost in the north pose significant threats to the structural integrity, stability, and performance of mining-related infrastructure, and that's including transportation networks, tailings dams, containment ponds, buildings, for example. Increasing extreme weather can challenge tailing ponds and dams, also leading to instability or failure. And climate-induced droughts and altered precipitation patterns may affect water and energy availability, and also impacts to vegetation on reclaimed land. So the CAMCOSHA Climate Change Risk Assessment was actually part of a larger project funded by Natural Resources Canada, as mentioned by John at the beginning of the session. And the objective of the project, there were several, and they're listed on the screen here. So we conducted a review of rehabilitation plans across a range of abandoned and orphan mine sites in Canada to determine whether and how they accounted for climate change. We conducted a climate change risk assessment for one site, which is the CAMCOSHA site located near Timmins, Ontario. And as part of that, we identified, assessed, and prioritized management risks and opportunities, as well as proposed adaptation measures to help reduce the climate change risks that were identified. And we see benefits for other abandoned and orphan mine sites in Ontario and other jurisdictions. And this includes identification of risks that could be common across abandoned and orphan mine sites, development and testing of a risk assessment framework, and we making it as transferable as possible for other sites. And then potentially leveraging the work done on CAMCOSHA to provide a screening level analysis of potential vulnerabilities, again, at other comparable sites across Ontario and elsewhere. So now I'll pass the mic over to Glenn, who will talk about the climate change risk assessment at CAMCOSHA. Glenn?
Great. Thanks, Jackie. So what I wanted to do before I jump into the risk assessment process and some of the results and recommendations that stemmed out of that work is just provide a bit of contextual information around Kamkosha and its mining operations and its state of remediation works, because that is very important as it informs the risk assessment process and the actual draft conversations around scenarios that may occur. So I wanted just to begin with a bit of an overview of what Kamkosha was about and when it was in operations. So it is a former copper and zinc mine located up near Timmins, Ontario. And it was mined initially from the 1943 to 44, and then again from 61 to 72. It was closed in 1972 and largely left abandoned until ownership transferred to the government of Ontario, where a lot of the significant effort has been on remediation works and really dealing with the acid generating tailings associated with the operations. And so you'll see in this picture here, which was taken in 2000, a few areas where tailings ultimately landed up, but 6 million tons of acid generating tailings were deposited in three areas, two of which were unimpounded. And you can see, sorry, I'm just going to say I'm getting a bit of an echo here, Suzanne. So I'll just continue on, but hopefully it resolves itself. But this is a picture of the site in the 2000s, and it has changed. And so that was an important characteristic of this assessment: is what was the state of the site prior to remediation? What has changed, and how has that implicated or changed how we might deal with risk assessments associated with climate change? So it's quite important to characterize the level of information and the documents that were available to us as part of this process. I did want to walk you through rapidly, very briefly, some of the remediation activities that have been going on since the government of Ontario has taken over ownership of Kamkosha. And it was largely a phased approach. And I apologize for the text on this slide, but it's quite important to understand how the various areas of this site have changed through time. And so you can see phase A of largely of the remediation works involved focusing on a lime addition treatment plant to deal with the water quality issues and the highly acidic water associated with the site. Phase B then involved relocation of some of the tailings, specifically from the former south unimpounded tailings area into an area that they now call the Nut impounded area behind an impoundment dam, and that was done in 2003. Since that time, phase C then involved additional relocation of tailings within that footprint, and phase D involved removing or relocating tailings from the creeks into that area and adding or placing and implementing a moist cover over top to secure the tailings in that particular area. And then the final phase, which is currently ongoing, is focusing on rehabilitation of general hazards on site, cleanup of other plant-related infrastructure, and back in 2005, actually, they also constructed a dry cover over some of the northern area of impounded tailings. And so this was largely important to understand prior to doing any sort of climate characterization or risk evaluation, to understand what are the major components that we're dealing with here, how are they connected hydrologically, and how might the impacts of extreme weather or climate change ultimately cause consequences associated with those on site, as well as off site in adjacent areas like the Little Kamoskosha River. And so just a quick overview of the site itself in terms of its large infrastructure components. It has several areas that you'll probably hear me mention a couple times on this presentation. The Nut, or the North Unimpounded Tailings area, which is behind a dam. The NIT, or the North Impounded Tailings area, again, both are now impounded since remediation has taken place. The South Unimpounded Tailings area has now been relocated, but it was there presently prior to 2000, as well as the acid water collection pond and water treatment plant that are on place and currently functional of the site, dealing with water quality improvements, and many other site-related infrastructure components. And so we began this process with a conversation with staff from the Government of Ontario and the Ministry of Energy, Northern Development and Mines to scope it, to really sit down and think about what are the components of Kamkosha that are important to assess or that you may be concerned with based on past impacts? And what should we really take focus of in terms of the scenarios that may occur, recognizing the importance to focus on what's within their mandate, but also recognizing that risks can cascade in several different ways. And so from there, I want to move into the climate characterization component of this process. And before I give too much away, this is actually a picture of an impact that has happened on the site, which was a dam breach. And I will walk through a bit of a forensic analysis of the climate conditions that led to this particular impact. But these things are important to characterize historically so we know what to look at in the future as climate conditions may be changing. But before I do that, why undertake a risk assessment and look at the impacts of climate change on these types of sites? And really, the purpose of a risk assessment is to apply up-to-date climate information and to identify the potential risks of climate impacts on the actual site and to guide our implementation efforts moving forward. And so there's a really great opportunity here to identify risks, potentially elevate remediation or prioritize remediation initiatives, and identify best practices associated with documenting information through time, and ultimately have those conversations now, given the fact that a lot of these sites that were in operations many, many decades ago were designed to different standards, and we now know the climate has shifted quite significantly, to Jackie's point earlier, since that time. And so there's a lot of important kind of characterization that needs to happen there around thresholds of failure on the site, as well as how climate conditions may be shifting and need to be taken into account. So we wanted to kind of provide a brief overview of the framework that was used for Kamkosha and specifically for abandoned and orphaned mine sites. And this was adapted and built upon from a report released in 2016 from NOAMI, which is the National Orphaned and Abandoned Mines Initiative. And this report really broke down how risk can be identified and how long-term management considerations can be thought of specifically in these contextual situations. And this was a 6-step process. So begin with scoping, then gathering information, which was a significant step, and I'll go through that in more detail later on, identifying potential scenarios of vulnerability and risk, creating the system we wanted to use to evaluate or score those scenarios, evaluating the risks, and ultimately identifying potential risk reduction measures and adaptation opportunities for this site and for other sites like Kamkosha. But importantly, it's needed to kind of be identified at this point that risk is a function of the likelihood and the consequences of a particular event occurring, and then the adaptive capacity of the site to respond. And so that was part of how we evaluated the risk in step 4 and 5, which I'll go through briefly today, but won't have a chance to get through all the logic and definitions behind the risk ranking system and the risk assessment, which are part of the reporting out of this project. So before we dove into identifying potential risks and vulnerabilities, we began with an event analysis and a climate characterization. And this schematic really just identifies the overall process that we looked at when it comes to climate modeling and information. And I'll just read it from left to right and kind of walk you through the logic. But the very first component is to identify the relevant climate hazards for this particular site and in the general area and topography region. This was done based on historical understanding of the hazards that drove impacts. And I'll speak to that on the coming slides around that dam impact that did happen back in 2012. So identifying the climate hazards that we know may cause impacts and potentially new climate hazards, refining those, having a bit of a discussion around the climate parameters that can be tied to climate modeling to inform how those hazards might be changing. Then we obtain climate projections. We ultimately analyze those for how they may be changing through time. We did that for 3 time horizons: historical, mid-century, and end of century. And then we ultimately use this information to assign likelihoods to inform the overall risk, that component of the risk evaluation or equation. And I will pause here and say that we had several discussions with staff around whether things should be done for the mid-century, end of century, and ultimately we did look at both, given the fact that a lot of the remediation works for Kamkosha are considered to be done in perpetuity or the need to do these over the long term. And so there was a strong interest to look at how risks might be changing over both time horizons rather than just one associated with particular pieces of infrastructure. And so just a bit of a forensic analysis to inform those hazards that were selected for Kamkosha. And this is a graph that shows air temperatures in the vicinity of the site. And it shows it end of February 2012 to March 20th, 2012, which was when there was a dam failure. And it shows the antecedent temperature conditions. So you can see how there was a rapid warm up about a week before March 20th. And this caused some significant snowmelt and a breach of the dam, which caused a release rather of the tailings on site. And so this is the type of characterization that we did prior to really walking through the entire risk evaluation to inform whether we understand design thresholds, thresholds of failure, and what are some of the climate characterizations or conditions that can ultimately be driving some of the impacts we're seeing on site. And so this is just one example of how this was done to identify some of the conditions of relevance. And you'll hear me talk a lot more about the water and the flooding associated with the site, because that was a big driver of some of the higher risks. So just a brief snapshot of some of the climate conditions. I won't go through all of this, but just in terms of how climate may be changing in this area, I'll look at the future changes here at the bottom of this slide. But it was found that the highest increases in total precipitation are expected in the winter season up in this area, with potentially less precipitation in the summer, both in the mid-century and end of century. We also looked at how the annual water budget, specifically moisture surplus and moisture deficit, may be changing across seasons, and how that may be contributing to flooding. And so what we found was that there may be significant increases in water surplus in the winter season, but significant increases in water deficit in the fall and summer, which is consistent with some of the modeling projections around potential drier conditions in late summer, early fall, and potentially wetter conditions around the shoulder seasons of the winter as we're having melting and in the winter season itself. And so what I'd like to do now is just walk you through a couple of graphs that were provided in the report that help to inform these characterization and the narratives that were used to drive some of the impacts. So this first graph is showing freeze-thaw cycles on a monthly basis as an average condition over the climate normal period. So this is representing multiple decades, each one of these columns. And you can read this from left to right, where left is the historical condition, and this is showing business as usual, or worst case emissions, RCP 8.5, out into the end of century. And what we're seeing here is that in December, January, February, and a little bit in March, we're seeing these freeze-thaw cycles increase through time. But in every other season, we're seeing them decrease. And this will be important for Kamkosha as it relates to melting and freeze-thaw of the snow and the ice conditions on the site that are important to capture and take into account as to how we've seen some impacts already. So the seasonal dynamics here are quite important. This is a pretty complicated graph, but I'll just emphasize the two key messages here that are created in the call-out boxes here, which is around the water balance. And this is evaluated based on potential actual evapotranspiration and the total precipitation, looking at water surplus and deficit. And what we're really seeing is that there's an increasing water surplus in January, February, and March, and an increasing water deficit in the summertime. So again, thinking about how this impacts the actual infrastructure and the remediation that's taking place